When you think of the Tower of London today, it may be the photographs that come to mind: neat stone walls, uniformed yeoman warders in their striking red and black, tourists filing past displays of armor and jewels. But to step back into the medieval centuries is to see something altogether different. The walls were there, yes, but they loomed darker, less restored, streaked with damp from rain that crept in from the Thames. The ground outside the walls was often muddy, churned by the hooves of horses and the boots of guards. And the tower, in those centuries, was as much a place of confinement as it was a fortress of kings. Your journey to the tower might have begun days earlier. Perhaps you were taken from your home in the early morning, the street outside still quiet. Or perhaps you were seized publicly, paraded through the market so others might learn the consequences of disloyalty, of debt, or of merely being on the wrong side of a dispute. Either way, by the time you saw the tower's silhouette, you would already be weary. Approaching from the river was the most common route for high-profile prisoners. The Thames was the city's highway, and its currents carried not only goods and merchants but also the accused and condemned. The river journey was slow, especially if the tide was against you. The boat, usually a simple barge or wherry, would rock gently, the slap of water against the wooden hull marking the passing minutes. The smell of the Thames in those days was far from fresh: refuse from the city, waste from tanneries and slaughterhouses, all found its way into the current. That smell would linger in your clothes, in your hair, in your mind. From the river, the tower's white tower, the great square keep at its heart, would rise into view. Its pale stone stood out against the darker curtain walls, and if the day was grey, the whole structure seemed to merge with the clouds. The sight was meant to impress and intimidate, a reminder of royal authority. And then came the turning of the boat toward Traitor's Gate. The archway was low, its stone damp and slick. Above it, the walls rose sheer, offering no glimpse of what lay beyond. The gate had been built for water access, but it became infamous for receiving prisoners who would never again walk free. The boat would glide under the arch, the sound of water echoing in the tunnel-like space. The light dimmed. You might see moss growing between the stones, tiny ferns clinging to cracks. Guards would be waiting on the landing, their boots planted wide, spears or halberds at their sides. The transition from the rocking boat to the solid, cold flagstones of the landing was abrupt. And with that step, you were inside. Inside, the first impression was not of one large hall or chamber, but of passageways, long, narrow, and lined with heavy wooden doors banded in iron. The air was cool and still, smelling faintly of oil from torches and lamps. Somewhere, water dripped steadily. The guards spoke little, their voices low if they spoke at all. They had walked these passages countless times. For them, there was nothing remarkable in your arrival. The first order of business was usually the recording of your name, your alleged crime, and the date. This could be done formally, with ink on parchment, or informally, with a jailer committing the details to memory until they were written later. Some prisoners' names appear clearly in surviving tower records, others vanish from the official account entirely, existing only in rumors. Your possessions were next. If you carried a purse, it would be taken. Weapons, of course, were forbidden, though a knife might be allowed if your status was high enough. Rings, seals, letters, even belts could be confiscated. For common prisoners, this was often the moment they realized just how little control they had left. A belt might not seem much, but without it, your clothing could become cumbersome, uncomfortable, even humiliating. The tower was not a single dungeon. It was a collection of buildings and towers within a larger complex, and your placement depended on your status, your crime, and sometimes the personal whims of those in charge. Nobles and wealthy merchants accused of political crimes might find themselves in rooms with small windows, a fireplace, and a proper bed. These were still prisons, guarded, locked, inescapable, but they allowed a measure of comfort. Others, particularly commoners accused of theft or violence, were taken to far more austere quarters. The lower dungeons were among the harshest. Reached by narrow spiral staircases, they grew colder and damper with each step downward. The stone underfoot could be slick with condensation, and the walls seemed to press closer the deeper you went. Light was scarce, sometimes provided only by a single torch mounted near the entrance. Inside, there might be nothing but straw for bedding, replenished infrequently, if at all. The smell of mildew was constant, and in wet weather, water could seep in through the walls. For the prisoner, the first days were the most bewildering. You might be given no clear sense of what would happen next, whether you would be tried, interrogated, or simply left to wait. The uncertainty gnawed at the mind. Some kept count of days by scratches on the wall, others lost track entirely, the monotony erasing the line between one day and the next. Food came according to a schedule, though the quality varied enormously. High-status prisoners might have meals brought from the outside, roast meats, fresh bread, wine, but for most, the fare was simple, coarse bread, a broth that might contain meat or might not, and ale. Water was rarely served unless requested. In medieval London, ale was considered safer to drink. The meals were brought in wooden bowls or on trenchers of stale bread, the latter serving as both plate and edible accompaniment. The sounds of the tower played a large role in shaping the prisoner's early impressions. The clank of keys was the most distinctive, long iron keys, heavy enough to feel like a weapon, hanging from the jailer's belt. Boots on stone echoed down the corridors, sometimes misleadingly close, sometimes distant. Voices carried strangely, bouncing off walls so that it was hard to tell where they came from. Sometimes you might hear the faint laughter of guards, or the murmured conversation of another prisoner in a nearby cell. Cold was another constant companion. Even in summer, the tower's thick walls held a chill. In winter, the cold could seep into your bones, making joints ache and fingers numb. Straw bedding might offer some insulation, but it quickly grew damp from the moisture in the air. Those with influence might receive blankets or cloaks, the rest endured as best they could, curling into themselves to preserve warmth. The hierarchy within the tower was clear. At the top was the constable of the tower, often a nobleman appointed by the king, responsible for the entire fortress. Below him, the lieutenant of the tower oversaw daily operations, including the treatment of prisoners. Then came the warders and jailers, whose individual temperaments could greatly affect a prisoner's experience. Some were indifferent, doing only what their duty required, others took pleasure in exerting control, withholding comforts unless bribed. For many, the worst part of the first days was not the cold or the food, but the stillness. Outside, London bustled, markets opened with the cries of vendors, bells rang for services, ships moved along the Thames. Inside, time slowed. Hours stretched out, unmarked except by the arrival of meals or the brief visits of guards. The mind, deprived of stimulation, turned inward, replaying the events that led to arrest, imagining every possible outcome. Some prisoners passed the time by talking to themselves, whispering prayers, or pacing the small space available. Others simply sat, conserving their strength. Writing was possible only if you had the means, parchment, ink, and permission, which most did not. Stories circulated about prisoners scratching messages into the walls with bits of stone or metal, though these were often discovered and erased. It was in these early days that you began to understand the tower's true power. It was not in the chains, nor even in the threat of execution. It was in the removal of the familiar, the sudden cutting away of all that marked your daily life, leaving only stone, silence, and uncertainty. And in that space, the tower could hold you for days, weeks, or years, with no change but the slow passage of time. The question that lingered, unspoken but ever present, was simple: what will become of me? And in the Tower of London, in the first days of your imprisonment, that question had no answer. By the time the first few days in the Tower of London have passed, you begin to sense that time is no longer measured in the same way it once was. Outside, life follows the rise and fall of the sun, the ringing of church bells, the rhythm of markets and mealtimes. Inside these walls, time becomes an altogether slower, heavier thing. It does not rush forward, it drips, drop by drop, like water from a leaky roof, marking its presence with no urgency, but an unavoidable persistence. The medieval tower was not designed for comfort. It was designed for endurance, both for those who guarded it and those who were kept within it. The daily routine of a prisoner was not so much a schedule as it was a cycle of recurring moments, repeated over and over until the mind could barely separate one from another. The day for a prisoner in the tower did not always begin at sunrise. In the deeper dungeons, there was no clear sign of dawn at all. The first awareness that the day had started came instead with the sound of movement beyond the cell door. Boots on stone. The dull clink of keys, the groan of a heavy wooden door opening somewhere down the corridor. The air might feel slightly fresher than it had in the night, if the jailers had opened a window or shifted a shutter. For some prisoners, particularly those of higher rank, a servant or guard might bring in water for washing, cold, of course, and in a basin not much larger than a bowl. The act of washing was brief, not for comfort but for basic hygiene. Soap was rare and harsh, often it was little more than lye mixed with animal fat, and it left the skin dry and rough. Common prisoners rarely had even this. Their washing consisted of splashing a little water from a jug onto their face and hands, if they were lucky enough to have such a jug. Clothing, once so much a part of a person's identity, quickly became uniform in its condition. Fine fabrics grew creased, worn at the elbows and cuffs, wool cloaks absorbed the damp and began to smell faintly of mildew. For those who had arrived in rougher garments, the wear showed in thinning knees, frayed hems, and the constant itch of unwashed linen against the skin. Breakfast, as you might know it today, was not a common concept in medieval England. Most prisoners received their first food of the day later in the morning, perhaps around the 8th or 9th hour by the church's reckoning. This meal was simple, coarse bread, often a little stale, sometimes served with a thin broth or pottage. The pottage could contain barley or oats, and if fortune favored you, a few shreds of meat or vegetable. The bread itself was rarely the fine white loaf enjoyed by the wealthy. It was usually made from mixed grains, sometimes with bits of chaff left in. It could be filling, but it was also dense, requiring effort to chew. Ale often accompanied the bread, not the strong ale brewed for feasts, but a weaker, small ale with low alcohol content, considered safer than water. The way the meal was served depended on your status. Nobles might eat from wooden trenchers or pewter plates, with a guard or servant standing by. Common prisoners might have their food passed to them through a small hatch in the door, or placed on the floor by a guard who had no intention of stepping inside. Eating was done quickly, food left sitting would soon cool in the chill air, and the taste was never improved by coldness. After the morning meal, the tower settled into a kind of stillness. Guards patrolled the walls, but inside, the corridors grew quiet. For a prisoner, these hours were often the longest. There was little to do but sit, pace, or think. The mind might wander to memories of life before arrest, the sounds of home, the faces of family, the feeling of sun on your skin. Or it might circle endlessly around the events that had led you here, replaying them with all the clarity that comes from having nothing else to distract you. If you were fortunate enough to have paper and ink, privileges reserved for the influential or the literate, you might spend this time writing letters or notes. Some wrote appeals to the authorities, others recorded their thoughts in what would later become memoirs. But for the majority, there was only waiting. In some parts of the tower, you might hear the faint noises of the city beyond the walls, a bell ringing for mass, the shouts of traders along the wharf, the creak of ships rigging in the wind. These sounds were reminders that life continued without you, indifferent to your absence. In other cells, especially the deeper ones, there was nothing but the occasional drip of water and the scurry of unseen rats. Sometime after noon, the second meal of the day would arrive. This was often the largest, though large is a relative term. Again there was bread, perhaps a thicker pottage, sometimes salted fish or a portion of boiled meat. In winter, the meat might be salted pork, its taste sharp from preservation. In summer, fresh fish from the Thames was possible, though its freshness depended greatly on the speed of delivery. Those who could afford it, or whose friends or family could send it, might receive better food from outside the tower. Roasted fowl, pies filled with spiced meat, cheeses, and fresh fruit occasionally found their way to the cells of wealthy prisoners. But for most, variety was rare. The monotony of the diet was itself a kind of slow punishment, dulling the senses with repetition. Eating was often done in solitude, though some prisoners were kept together in shared spaces. Shared cells were not necessarily more social, silence could hang just as heavily among several as it did in solitude, each person lost in their own thoughts. Afternoons in the tower stretched endlessly. Light filtered through small windows or arrow slits, moving so slowly across the floor that it seemed to stand still. Guards changed shifts, their footsteps breaking the monotony for only a few moments. The air grew colder as the day wore on, the stone releasing the heat it had gathered, which, in the shaded depths of the tower, was never much to begin with. Some prisoners prayed to pass the time, reciting the same words over and over, letting the rhythm soothe the mind. Others counted, cracks in the wall, steps across the cell, scratches on the floor. A few tried to exercise in the limited space, but most simply conserved their energy, unsure how long they would need to endure. The final meal, if it came, was small, perhaps bread and ale again, or a little leftover broth. After that, the tower's passages grew quieter. Torches were lit along the main corridors, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The deeper cells might receive no light at all beyond what the guard carried during rounds. Night brought its own sounds. The wind could be heard through high windows or narrow slits. In some cells, you might hear the faint slap of the Thames against the walls outside. Rats moved more freely in the darkness, and their skittering feet were a common companion. Sleep was rarely deep. The cold could wake you, as could the hardness of the bedding or the discomfort of damp straw. Dreams, when they came, were often vivid, perhaps because the waking hours offered so little to engage the mind. Prisoners sometimes dreamed of open fields, of walking freely through the streets, only to wake to the sight of the same grey stones. Over days and weeks, the routine imprinted itself so deeply that you could predict the smallest events, the guard's approach by the sound of his steps, the creak of the meal cart, the faint change in air when a door opened at the far end of the corridor. Nothing changed, yet the days still passed, one after another. This sameness was part of the tower's quiet control. Without variety, without markers of time, the mind softened. Resistance required energy, and energy drained away in the slow, steady erosion of the routine. The tower did not need to harm you actively, it simply enclosed you, surrounded you with stone, and let the days do their work. And as you lay awake in the cold, listening to the distant water and the turning of keys, you could not help but wonder, how many more days will there be? The first loaves were drawn from the oven with deliberate care, each one placed gently onto long, worn wooden boards. The baker's hands, dusted in flour, moved without urgency. He lifted each loaf as if it might bruise, and set it down in a neat row where the morning light could touch their crusts. The steam that rose was pale and slow, curling upward before vanishing into the cool air. The bakery was filled with a deep, steady warmth, the kind that made one linger. Outside, the frost was still unbroken on the rooftops, and the thin sound of a crow drifted over the village. Inside, the scent of fresh bread was almost too much, heavy and rich, yet comforting in its weight. The baker paused, leaning on the wooden paddle. For a long moment, simply watching the loaves as they rested. The cooling was its own kind of work. The loaves could not be stacked yet, they had to sit with space between them so the crust would not soften. One by one, he turned them slightly, letting the air reach every side. His breath rose in faint clouds when he moved closer to the open doorway, where the cold crept in at the edges. The door opened without a knock, and the first villager stepped inside, an older woman with a scarf pulled tightly around her head. She carried a shallow basket, the bottom lined with cloth. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, as she greeted the baker. He nodded, reached for a loaf that had cooled just enough, and lowered it into her basket. No coin changed hands immediately. In the village, accounts were kept in memory until the week's end. A younger man followed, smelling faintly of the smoke from his own hearth. He stood quietly while the baker wrapped his bread in a square of coarse linen. Outside, a cart rolled slowly over frozen earth, the sound dull and heavy. The morning thickened with the steady rhythm of these arrivals. A woman with a child at her side, a bent man with hands so worn they seemed carved from old wood, a boy sent by his mother, clutching a few copper coins in his palm. Each received their loaf, each lingered for a moment in the warm air before stepping back into the winter. When the last of the bread had been given out, the baker stood alone again. The oven was cooling now, its fire no longer fierce but glowing faintly in the dim light. He brushed the remaining flour from the work table into a small wooden bin, then covered the unused dough with a damp cloth for the afternoon baking. The bakery settled into a stillness. Outside, the village carried on, slow footsteps over frozen ground, the faint sound of a dog barking far away. Inside, the only movement was the thin steam still rising from a few loaves left on the rack, curling upward in the quiet. In the waning hours of a summer evening, the city of Istanbul did not go to sleep. Instead, it seemed to awaken in a different way, not with the clamor of the day, but with the slow and steady rhythm of night. As the sun sank beneath the horizon, shopkeepers along the narrow alleys lit their oil lamps, and strings of paper lanterns began to glow above the bustling streets. The Bosphorus itself shimmered like a sheet of black silk scattered with gold dust, reflecting the lights of hundreds of small fishing boats that swayed gently against their moorings. Night markets were not mere places of commerce in 18th-century Istanbul, they were a form of theater. Fishermen would haul their evening catch directly to the stalls, and the air would quickly fill with the aroma of grilling mackerel and spiced lamb. Women in bright silk shawls haggled softly for figs and dates, their laughter mixing with the sound of clinking copper coins. From the docks, the deep hum of merchant ships echoed across the water, carrying goods from Venice, Alexandria, and far-off Bombay. Among the stalls, children darted through the crowds with sticky fingers clutching syrup-drenched lakma, while elderly men leaned against carved wooden railings, sipping thick coffee from tiny porcelain cups. Above all, there was the constant low murmur of voices, not hurried, but unhurried, as if everyone here had stepped into a gentler version of the city, where the night was long and there was no reason to rush. In the heart of the market, under the grand shadow of the Galata Tower, the scene shifted from the purely commercial to the deeply cultural. Here, the air was dense with competing scents, cardamom from the coffee stalls, salt from the roasted pistachios, and the earthy perfume of freshly ground sumac. Merchants sat cross-legged on woven rugs, displaying bolts of fabric dyed in deep indigo and pomegranate red. Every now and then, a buyer would stroke the cloth between thumb and forefinger, appraising the weave before nodding to a silent agreement on the price. Street musicians played in corners where the crowd slowed, a ney flute here, a two-stringed kemench there, their melodies winding through the alleyways like the smoke from the braziers. Beside them, storytellers drew small crowds by candlelight, recounting tales of sultans, lost love, and mythical creatures said to haunt the waters of the Golden Horn. Their voices rose and fell like the tide, and in the dim flicker of lanterns, it was easy to forget the century one lived in. The night market was not only for the wealthy. Porters, fishermen, and washerwomen mingled freely with foreign diplomats and spice traders. Deals were made as often with a handshake as with silver coins, and a shared bowl of soup could seal a friendship more firmly than any written contract. This was a place where language barriers dissolved into gestures, and every exchange, whether for a basket of apricots or a string of pearls, carried with it the possibility of a story worth retelling. As the hours slipped past midnight, the crowd thinned, though the market never fully died. The wealthiest patrons had returned to their mansions, their purchases loaded into lacquered chests. Sailors from distant ports still lingered over late cups of coffee, swapping sea stories that blended truth and exaggeration until they were indistinguishable. Cats prowled between the emptying stalls, their eyes catching the last flickers of lamplight. The Bosphorus breeze grew cooler, carrying with it the scent of brine and the faintest hint of rain. Lanterns began to go out one by one, their warm glow replaced by the pale silver of approaching dawn. Merchants carefully packed away their goods, folding fabrics into cedar chests and sealing jars of saffron with wax. The storytellers closed their books, musicians tucked away their instruments, and the great market seemed to sigh as if settling into a well-earned rest. By the time the first call to prayer floated over the city, the transformation was complete. The night market, so vibrant and alive only hours before, had melted back into the narrow stone streets, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of grilled fish and the soft memory of laughter. Yet for those who had walked its lantern-lit alleys, the experience would remain, a small, timeless pocket of Istanbul's soul, held forever in the mind's quiet corners. The Grand Canal had been a ribbon of life in China for more than 1,000 years, stretching from the bustling capital in the north to the fertile rice paddies in the south. By the time of the Ming dynasty, it was not just a waterway, it was an artery carrying food, people, and stories across the length of the empire. To stand at its banks in the early morning was to witness the slow awakening of a world that moved entirely to the rhythm of water. The day began with mist. Thin and pearly, it hung low over the canal, curling around the masts of docked barges and clinging to the tiled roofs of warehouses. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and cooked millet porridge drifting from the homes along the shore. You could hear the faint lap of water against stone as small fishing boats glided by, their rowers moving with unhurried strokes. Farther away, the deeper groan of large grain barges carried over the stillness, the sound softened by the morning fog. Boatmen rose before the sun, moving with the quiet efficiency of people who had done the same work every day for decades. They checked the heavy hemp ropes securing their cargo, brushed frost from their decks, and shared simple breakfasts, steamed buns, salted fish, tea brewed in rough clay pots. Many wore the same layered cotton coats and quilted trousers year after year, the fabric patched and mended until it carried more stitches than original cloth. They worked in pairs or small crews, speaking in low voices so as not to disturb the sleeping passengers or shopkeepers in the waterside inns. Along the embankment, vendors began to appear, setting up for the day's trade. Women in indigo-dyed jackets laid out baskets of fresh vegetables, spring onions, radishes, cabbages still beaded with dew from the morning fields. Men carrying poles balanced across their shoulders brought in fish caught just hours before, the silver scales still flashing under the pale light. The mingling scents of raw river fish, chopped herbs, And boiling soy sauce wafted from open stalls, announcing that the canal-side market was stirring to life. Some travelers had arrived overnight, mooring their boats in clusters near the city's main gate. They emerged yawning and stretching, their breath steaming in the cool air. Merchants from the south checked their precious cargo, bundles of tea leaves, jars of fermented bean paste, bolts of fine silk wrapped in protective cloth, while northern traders prepared to unload shipments of wheat, millet, and coal. Each package was marked with inked characters noting its origin and destination, a quiet record of the canal's endless exchanges. As the light grew stronger, the outlines of the city beyond the canal became clearer. Narrow lanes twisted away from the docks, lined with small tea shops, hostels, and warehouses whose doors stood open to catch the morning breeze. Children darted between the legs of their parents, carrying small errands, delivering a message to a boat captain, bringing a wrapped bundle of steamed dumplings to a stall owner, or fetching hot water for tea. Their bare feet slapped against the wooden planks of the docks, their laughter rising like birdsong above the low murmur of business beginning. Barges bound for the capital were prepared with particular care. These were the empire's grain ships, carrying rice from the fertile southern provinces to feed the enormous population of Beijing. Their decks were stacked high with sacks, each sealed with official wax stamps to prevent theft or tampering. Imperial inspectors walked among them, counting, checking, and occasionally taking samples for quality. The captain stood at respectful attention, answering questions in clipped tones, knowing that delays could cost them precious days on the journey north. Even in the stillness of morning, the Grand Canal never truly rested. Somewhere upstream, a flotilla of barges might be passing under an arched stone bridge, the rhythmic clack of oars echoing off its walls. Downstream, fishermen hauled in their first catches, shaking the nets to free small, wriggling carp into baskets. The canal's water was not always clean. Close to the city it carried the waste of thousands of households, but farther out, the currents ran clearer, carrying the reflection of the sky like a liquid mirror. For the people who lived along its banks, the canal was not simply a place of travel, it was a neighbor, a companion, and in some ways, a ruler. It dictated when food would arrive, when prices would rise or fall, and when strangers from distant provinces might appear at the dockside inns. In flood season, it could bring disaster, spilling over its stone embankments into the narrow streets. In drought, it might shrink and slow, stranding barges for weeks. Everyone who depended on it understood this dual nature, and they treated the water with both respect and caution. By mid-morning, the mist had burned away, revealing the full, shining length of the canal. The sun warmed the damp wooden planks, coaxing out the smell of tar and rope from the moored ships. Calls from boatmen rang out, orders to push off, warnings to keep clear, and the quiet of early dawn gave way to the busier hum of day. The great artery of China was in motion once again, carrying with it not just goods and travelers, but the heartbeat of a civilization. The late morning sun had climbed higher, its pale golden light spilling over the eaves of the riverside stalls. The sounds of the market had shifted since dawn. The brisk energy of the early hours, when porters shouted and merchants jostled to claim the freshest goods, had mellowed into something slower, softer. Bargaining still happened, but with less urgency. The heavy purchases had already been made, now, the market belonged to those with time to linger. By the edge of the river, old men in plain robes sat cross-legged on low stools, slowly peeling oranges whose scent floated in the air. The peels were dropped into woven baskets, to be sold later for medicinal infusions. A young boy, perhaps 8 years old, sat beside them, carefully sorting the fruit into piles by size. He worked in silence, his eyes occasionally following the dragonflies that danced above the rippling water. Further down the path, a cloth seller had draped bolts of silk over a wooden rail so they caught the sunlight. The colors, deep indigo, warm ochre, and a red so vivid it seemed almost alive, shimmered gently whenever a breeze passed through. A woman with a hairpin shaped like a silver lotus leaned close, running her fingers across the fabric's fine weave. She did not speak, the merchant did not push. In the Tang markets, the act of examining was part of the ritual, and rushing it would be considered impolite. Nearby, an incense vendor adjusted the small clay braziers on his table. Thin streams of smoke curled upward, carrying the rich scent of sandalwood and the sharp brightness of camphor. Some customers paused simply to breathe it in, not intending to buy, but the merchant didn't mind. He had been here for 20 years, and knew that the memory of a smell could bring a customer back weeks later. Beneath the awning of a tea stall, boatmen rested on benches, their wide straw hats tilted over their eyes. They sipped slowly from small porcelain cups, letting the steam warm their faces. The tea was bitter at first taste, but softened into a pleasant sweetness. At another table, a scholar in pale blue robes was writing in a notebook, his brush making deliberate, careful strokes. Every so often, he would glance toward the river, as if drawing inspiration from the way the water caught the light. Even the river itself seemed slower now. Barges drifted with minimal splashing, their oars dipping in a steady, unhurried rhythm. A faint smell of wetwood came from the moored boats, mingling with the faint tang of fish being grilled at a food stall nearby. The cook, a man with arms brown from years in the sun, turned the skewers with methodical precision. Each movement was unhurried, and the sizzling sound was just loud enough to be heard over the quiet murmur of voices. No one was in a rush. In this hour between the morning's work and the evening's trade, the river market belonged to stillness. It was not the kind of stillness that came from emptiness, but from a shared understanding among merchants, travelers, and locals alike, that there was value in moving slowly, in letting the day unfold at its own pace. By the time the sun had dipped low enough to turn the river silver, the market's rhythm changed again. Lanterns began to appear one by one, their paper sides painted with flowers, cranes, or curling clouds. Their warm light reflected on the water's surface, doubling their glow. The voices of merchants grew louder now, not the urgent cries of the morning, but the inviting tones meant to draw in those making their last purchases before nightfall. Along the riverside, the food stalls came alive. A vendor boiled dumplings in a wide copper pot, the steam rising so thick it blurred the faces of those waiting in line. The smell was irresistible, a mixture of garlic, ginger, and fresh chives. Beside him, a young girl ladled congee into bowls, the soft rice porridge glistening under the lantern light. She handed them out with both hands, a small gesture of respect that her grandmother had taught her. Fishermen returned from the water, their bamboo poles balanced on their shoulders. The day's catch, silver carp, grass fish, and small shrimp, was laid out on woven mats. Some customers bought immediately, knowing that tomorrow's fish would not be as fresh. Others waited, gambling that prices would drop as the hour grew late. Bargaining, in this soft evening light, seemed more like a conversation than a contest. Laughter often followed the final handshake. Children ran barefoot along the wooden docks, chasing each other between crates and baskets. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of river mud and the sharper smell of vinegar from a nearby pickle stall. Somewhere down the row, a musician began to play the pipa, the notes light and bright at first, then settling into a slower, more reflective tune. Passers-by slowed their steps to listen, some placing coins into the small wooden bowl at his feet. At the far end of the market, an elderly couple sat side by side, selling candied hawthorn skewers. They barely spoke, working in quiet harmony, the man dipping the fruit into syrup, the woman arranging the finished skewers so they caught the lantern light. Occasionally, one would glance toward the river, as if to make sure the world outside their small stall was still turning at its steady pace. As darkness deepened, the reflections of the lanterns became sharper in the water, and the sound of the market softened into a low, steady hum. The river itself seemed to hold the day's stories, the hurried footsteps of morning, the quiet drift of midday, the warm gatherings of evening. For those who had been here from dawn, it was easy to feel that the market had breathed in and out, like a living thing, and was now settling into rest. By the time the last boats untied from the docks and the lanterns swayed gently in the night breeze, the market was no longer just a place of trade. It had become a shared memory for everyone who had walked its paths, bargained over its goods, or simply stood still to watch the light dance on the river. And tomorrow, it would all begin again, quietly, patiently, at the river's own pace. As the caravan pressed onward, the merchant could sense the faint scent of sea salt drifting in the cool morning air. This was a promising sign. The distant port city was drawing nearer, though the road still wound through hills that seemed determined to slow their pace. The mules plodded with steady determination, their hooves clinking against scattered stones. Each clink seemed to echo in the quiet landscape, almost like a ticking clock measuring the last moments before the long-awaited destination. The merchant's body was weary, but his mind remained sharply attuned to every detail of the road ahead. He had learned from many years of travel that the most dangerous part of a journey often came right at the end. Bandits knew that travelers were eager to finish, and that their caution sometimes slipped in the final stretch. So, despite his longing to hurry forward, he kept the pace slow and watchful. Along the way, they passed small clusters of farmhouses, their walls made of pale stone and their roofs covered with weathered tiles. In the fields, peasants bent over rows of barley, their backs glistening under the afternoon sun. A group of children, curious but shy, peeked out from behind a fence made of woven sticks. One of them waved hesitantly, and the merchant, smiling beneath his dusty hood, raised a gloved hand in return. These small human encounters were what kept the journey from becoming an endless blur of miles. As the caravan entered a narrow pass between two steep ridges, the air cooled noticeably. The wind funneled through the gap, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and wild rosemary. The ridges were dotted with scraggly pines, their twisted roots gripping at the rocks as if unwilling to let go. The path here was barely wide enough for two mules to walk side by side, and the sound of their breathing filled the enclosed space. Every so often, a pebble would tumble down the slope, reminding them of how precarious the passage truly was. By evening, the land began to descend, and the first hints of the distant coastline appeared, a faint shimmer on the horizon, glowing gold in the setting sun. The merchant allowed himself a rare moment of relief. The sea meant ships, and ships meant trade, rest, and perhaps a warm bed that did not sway with the uneven rhythm of a mule's gait. That night, they camped within sight of the city walls, though still far enough to remain outside the noise and bustle. The stars emerged like scattered embers in the dark sky, and the merchant lay awake longer than usual, listening to the quiet. Tomorrow, the final steps would be taken. Tomorrow, the journey's purpose would be fulfilled. And yet, in his heart, he knew that each arrival was merely the beginning of another departure, another road, another set of miles waiting to be walked. As the day wore on and the pale light of late afternoon began to tilt toward dusk, the tea-house shifted into a slower, more deliberate rhythm. The bustle of the midday crowd had ebbed away. The traveling merchants had returned to their lodging, the couriers had resumed their errands, and the small groups of townsfolk had dispersed into the winding streets beyond. What remained was a quiet, almost contemplative atmosphere, one that seemed to draw the space into itself, as if the building, too, knew it was approaching the close of its working day. The air inside felt softer now. Steam still rose gently from a small copper kettle in the corner, but it drifted more lazily than before. The scent of brewed tea lingered in the beams overhead, mingled with the faint aroma of aged wood and dried bamboo. A broom's slow bristles whispered across the floorboards as one of the younger attendants began the evening sweep. Each stroke was unhurried, the kind of movement that seemed designed to soothe rather than merely clean. At one table near the window, a scholar in pale blue robes remained, dipping his brush into an inkwell, pausing after each character as if weighing its worth. His paper caught the last streaks of daylight, while outside, the narrow lane grew steadily darker. Lanterns in nearby shops began to glow, first as soft orange orbs, then as clear shapes once night fell fully. Their flickering light reached across the street, pressing thin shadows through the wooden lattice of the tea-house windows. In the kitchen, the large clay jars of tea leaves were carefully sealed for the night. A thin cloth was draped over each to guard against stray insects. The brazier fire, once lively with the day's constant boiling, was allowed to fade into glowing embers. A single ladle of hot water was poured over the iron teapot to clean it, not with haste, but in the practiced, ceremonial way that the senior hostess preferred. She always insisted that the utensils rest overnight. With care, so that the first tea brewed in the morning would carry no hint of yesterday's fatigue. Now and then, a soft murmur would rise from the few remaining guests, but it never reached the animated tones of earlier in the day. Instead, it was as if everyone present shared an unspoken agreement to match the quiet of the hour. Even the sound of pouring tea, a thin, delicate stream, seemed to harmonize with the subdued mood. Somewhere near the door, a cat stretched across the threshold, one paw extended into the evening air, watching as the final light slipped behind the rooftops. When the last patron rose to leave, the hostess accompanied him to the door, bowing slightly, her hands folded neatly at her waist. Outside, the city's night noises had begun, the distant beat of a drum announcing the change of watch, the occasional creak of a cartwheel on the stone road, the faint call of a vendor still selling candied fruit for the evening crowd. She closed the door quietly, not with a latch's snap, but with the muted push of wood against wood. Inside, the tea-house was left in the gentle glow of a few hanging lanterns. Shadows lay soft across the tables. The air was calm enough that one could hear the light flutter of a moth's wings near the wall. The attendants gathered the last cushions, stacked the cleaned cups, and wiped the low tables with folded cloths. Every action felt deliberate, as if the day itself were being folded away, layer by layer, until nothing remained but stillness. By the time the final lantern was extinguished, the room had settled into darkness. Only the faint scent of tea, that warm, leafy fragrance, remained to keep silent company through the night. Outside, the street continued its life, but within the tea-house, the world had narrowed to quiet wood, cooling air, and the promise of another morning. The night had settled over the desert like a vast silken shroud, the stars scattered across the heavens in a display so dense and brilliant it seemed almost unreal. Out here, far from the torches of the last village, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the soft glow of the moon and the dim flickers of lanterns swaying from the caravan's poles. Each step of the camels sank into the fine sand with a whisper, the kind of sound that vanished into the endless openness of the night. Marwan, the caravan master, rode at the front. His eyes, weathered from years of scanning horizons, stayed locked on a faint cluster of stars that served as their celestial guide. Behind him trailed a winding line of travelers, traders with their wares bundled in cloth, storytellers with nothing but words to trade, and wanderers chasing rumors of hidden cities buried under the dunes. The desert air at night was nothing like the day's breathless heat. It was cool, almost biting, and it carried scents that the sun had burned away earlier, distant sagebrush, the faint tang of dry rock, and sometimes the ghostly perfume of blooming desert flowers. The camels grumbled occasionally, their breath curling in the chill air, but otherwise the world seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere deep in the line of riders, a young boy named Haroun clutched his mother's hand. She told him that the desert could speak at night, if one knew how to listen. Haroun strained his ears, and indeed he began to notice the strange, soft murmurs that came from nowhere and everywhere, the shifting of the dunes, the sighing of the wind, and the occasional crack of cooling stone. It was as if the land itself remembered every traveler who had ever crossed it, whispering their footsteps into eternity. As the hours passed, the moon cast long silver paths across the sand, creating the illusion of rivers running through the emptiness. The caravan wove its way along these pale streams until Marwan raised his hand and brought them to a halt. Ahead, nestled in the crook of a half-buried rock formation, was a small oasis. It was no larger than a courtyard, with a shallow pool reflecting the stars and a ring of palm trees swaying gently in the breeze. The camels knelt with practiced weariness, and the travelers dismounted. Some fell to their knees to drink, their hands cupping the cool water, while others simply lay back on the sand and stared up at the wheeling constellations. A fire was lit from a small bundle of kindling carried all the way from the last settlement, and soon the smell of boiling tea drifted through the air. It was then that the storyteller, a thin man with a voice like warm honey, stood by the fire and began to speak. He told of the Whispering Dunes, a place said to lie several days' journey to the south, where the sands were haunted by the voices of those who had vanished there. Some believed it to be nothing more than the wind playing tricks, others swore that the dunes could reveal secrets to those who dared to sleep among them. The fire crackled, the tea steamed, and above them the stars wheeled slowly onward. When the tale ended, silence returned, deeper and heavier than before. One by one, the travelers curled into their blankets, the desert's lullaby carrying them into sleep. Marwan, however, remained awake, gazing out beyond the oasis into the dark ocean of sand. Somewhere out there lay the Whispering Dunes, and in the heart of the night, he thought he could almost hear them calling.